The paper hit the judge's desk like a gunshot. Augusta Easton stood at the back of the Redemption Creek courthouse with her hands pressed flat against the rough-hewn railing, her knuckles white, her dark eyes burning with something that had no clean name: fury and grief, and the kind of bone-deep terror that comes when the ground beneath your feet has been selling itself to a stranger for months without your knowledge. The courtroom smelled of pine resin and fresh sawdust, and the particular nervous sweat of 30 townsfolk who had squeezed themselves into a building that was never meant to hold the weight of this much consequence. Dorothea Vance stood at the front of the room, poised and silk-dressed and entirely too pleased with herself. She was beautiful in the way that a wolf trap is beautiful, all clean lines and deadly intention. She had arrived in Redemption Creek precisely 3 weeks ago on the morning stage, carrying 2 traveling trunks, a lawyer from Abilene, and a deed bearing the name of Augusta's late husband, Thomas Easton, alongside a signature that looked disturbingly real. Judge Hollis held the deed at arm's length and adjusted his spectacles. His face gave nothing away. He was a solid, deliberate man who had presided over Redemption Creek's legal affairs for 11 years, and Augusta had trusted him once. She was not sure she trusted anyone now. "This deed," Dorothea's lawyer said, smooth as oil on water, "was legally executed in the spring of 1881, prior to Thomas Easton's death, and transfers the full 320-acre Easton homestead, including the ranch house, the grazing lands, the water rights to Callow Creek, and all structures therein, to Miss Dorothea Vance of Wichita, Kansas, in exchange for a debt of $11,000. The number dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Ripples went outward in every direction. Augusta heard someone behind her whisper the word ruin, and she did not look to see who it was. She had lived on that land for 6 years. She had buried her husband in the soil of it 9 months ago. She had a 7-year-old son, Daniel, waiting at the neighbor's house a mile down the road, who had already lost his father and did not yet know he might be about to lose everything else. That was the moment Wallace Ramsey moved. He had been standing along the side wall with his hat in both hands, tall enough that he'd had to tilt his head slightly to avoid the low-hanging lantern, and Augusta had noticed him there the way she always noticed him, peripherally, in that involuntary way that certain people simply occupy space more than others. He was the foreman on the Caldwell ranch next door to hers, 31 years old, broad-shouldered and sunburned and relentlessly capable. He had helped her mend fence lines after the spring floods. He had brought venison in November when the roads were frozen. He had never once said a word that felt like anything other than honest. He crossed the floor in 4 strides. He picked up the deed from Judge Hollis's desk with one hand, and he tore it straight down the middle, the ripping sound filling every corner of that small courthouse like a crack of lightning. The room went absolutely silent. Dorothea Vance made a sound like a cat that had been stepped on. Her lawyer surged forward. Judge Hollis came half out of his chair. And Augusta Easton, standing at the back of the room, felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief. Not yet, because there was no relief available yet, but something fierce and involuntary, like a door that had been sealed shut for a very long time had just blown open in a sudden wind. "That document," Wallace Ramsey said, his voice low and completely level, "is a forgery." He let both halves fall to the floor. "And I can prove it." Augusta had met Thomas Easton in the spring of 1876 in Lawrence, Kansas, at a social organized by the Methodist Church where both their families worshipped on opposite sides of the same aisle. He was 24 and she was 22, and he had a way of talking about the future, his future, their future, the West's future, that made the horizon feel like a gift rather than a threat. She had loved him. She wanted to be clear about that, even now, even with everything. She had genuinely loved Thomas Easton, had married him within the year, had followed him to the raw, wide territory of western Kansas where he meant to homestead and build something durable. They had done it, too. Not easily, but they had done it. The 320 acres sat in a river bend where Callow Creek curved south before joining the larger tributary that fed the whole valley. Thomas had filed on it under the Homestead Act of 1862, proved up the claim after 5 years of continuous improvement, and received his full patent deed from the Government Land Office in the summer of 1881. He had shown Augusta the official document the evening it arrived, holding it by the lamp with both hands, grinning in a way that was almost boyish, and she had pressed her palm flat against the paper as if she could feel its legal weight as something physical. He had not mentioned any $11,000 debt. He had not mentioned any Dorothea Vance. Thomas died in late December of 1882 of a lung fever that moved faster than anyone expected. He was 30 years old. Their son Daniel had just turned 6. Augusta had arranged the burial, received the condolences, settled the minor debts that Thomas had left, the hardware account in town, the feed bill, a small loan from the bank that she had paid off by April, and then she had put her head down and run the ranch through the worst winter in recent memory, doing the work of 2 people because there was no other choice. When Dorothea Vance arrived on that March stage in 1883, Augusta did not even know her name yet. She heard about the stranger through Millie Corbett at the dry goods store, who mentioned a well-dressed woman asking questions about the Easton property at the land office, but Augusta was busy with the spring branding and had not paid it particular attention. She paid attention 3 days later when the sheriff served her with a legal notice of competing claim. That was when the fear arrived, cold and absolute, like the moment you realize you have been walking on ice without knowing it. She spent 2 days at the county seat going through Thomas's papers. She went to the bank. She talked to the land office clerk. She talked to the county recorder. Nothing in any official record supported the existence of any debt to any Dorothea Vance. The patent deed that Thomas had received from the Government Land Office was perfectly intact and registered in his name, and under the law of Kansas, that patent deed superseded any prior private transaction, though the competing deed Dorothea had produced was dated before the patent was issued, which was what gave it its legal complication and what had forced the hearing before Judge Hollis. On the second evening of her document search, Augusta had come out of the county records building to find Wallace Ramsey leaning against the hitching rail outside, his hat pulled low and a look on his face that she could only describe as purposeful. She stopped on the steps. He straightened up. "You didn't have to come all the way here," she said. "I know I didn't," he said. There was a silence. "I heard what happened," he said. "The Corbett woman mentioned it at the feed store, and then 3 other people mentioned it within the same hour, and then I rode into town myself to confirm it." Augusta came down the last step. And I think I know something useful." He paused. "Thomas showed me a letter he received last November, 2 months before he died. He was upset about it. I didn't read it, it wasn't mine to read, but he told me enough. He said a woman he'd known years ago was trying to claim he owed her money, that she had papers she'd had drawn up, and that it was a dark situation from his past that he was going to have his attorney handle." Augusta felt the ground tilt slightly. He knew about her. He knew, Wallace confirmed. He was planning to fight it, Augusta. He got sick before he could. She stood very still in the cold spring evening, the courthouse square empty around them, a wind coming down off the plains that smelled like distant rain. She was aware of a burning behind her eyes that she refused to let become tears. "Not here, not yet. He had an attorney," she said. "He never told me. His name is Frank Hale, out of Dodge City. I wrote to him 2 days ago. He wrote back this morning." Wallace reached into his coat and produced a letter. "He has the correspondence Thomas sent him regarding this exact situation. He has Thomas's written statement describing Dorothea Vance's claim as fraudulent, and he has something else." Augusta took the letter. She read it standing there in the fading light, and when she finished, she read it again. "He has a witness," she said. "A notary in Wichita who refused to authenticate the deed because the signature was wrong," Wallace said. He said the signature Thomas Easton gave him in the execution of another document in the same period didn't match the signature on Vance's deed. He noted it at the time. He still has his notation book. Augusta folded the letter carefully. She was going to ask him why he was doing this, why he had come to the county seat, why he had written to the attorney, why he was standing here in the early dark offering her the mechanism of her own rescue. But she did not ask, because she already understood in some part of herself that went below language that Wallace Ramsey's motives were not complicated. He was not doing this for profit, or for the land, or to collect a debt. He was doing it because he had sat across from her at her kitchen table the winter her husband was dying and watched her hold herself together with both hands, and something in him had decided then that whatever she needed, he would find a way to provide it. She did not know what to do with that knowledge. She tucked it away in the same interior place where she had been storing all of the other Wallace Ramsey observations, his laugh at the harvest supper, the way he had held Daniel on his shoulders at the Founders' Day parade, the fact that she had cataloged these things at all, which was itself a kind of admission she wasn't ready to make. "Thank you," she said. He put his hat back on. "Come on. I'll ride with you to the hotel." The hearing before Judge Hollis had been set for the following Monday, giving both parties 4 days to prepare and submit any supporting documentation. Augusta had spent those 4 days in a state of concentrated, sleepless purpose that left no room for fear, because there was simply no time for it. She and Wallace worked together across those 4 days in a way that felt both natural and urgently necessary. Him riding to Dodge City to retrieve attorney Frank Hale and the relevant documents, her organizing Thomas's papers at home, sorting through every financial record her husband had left, building a chronological picture of a man who had been dealing with a hidden threat in the last months of his life without telling his wife about it. That omission hurt. She had made herself sit with it on a quiet Wednesday afternoon when Daniel was asleep and the house was still, had turned the hurt over in her hands like a stone and looked at it from every side. Thomas had been protecting her from worry. That was his character. He had also, in protecting her, left her without information that would have been critically useful had he died, which is precisely what he did. She loved him for the impulse and mourned the consequence in equal measure. She was also angry, and she let herself feel that too. Attorney Frank Hale arrived in Redemption Creek on Saturday, a compact, precise man of 50 with a leather briefcase that he carried like it contained living things. He met with Augusta and Wallace that afternoon in the sitting room of the Redemption Creek Hotel and laid his documents out on the table with the methodical care of a man who had won more cases than he'd lost. "The deed Vance produced," Hale said, "is dated March of 1881. But Thomas's patent deed from the government was issued in June of 1881. Any private transaction occurring before the patent issuance would be legally complicated to enforce, but Vance's lawyer is arguing that the debt predates the patent and therefore carries an obligation that should be recognized even against it. That's where they think they have their foothold." "Can they win that argument?" Augusta asked. "In front of a judge who doesn't look too carefully, possibly, but there's a simpler problem with their deed." Hale set a document on the table. Thomas Easton's signature. "I have 3 authenticated examples of his signature from that same period. His patent application, a banknote, and a letter to me. You'll notice the loop on the capital E the way the T descends in Easton. The signature on Vance's deed was made by someone who knew how Thomas wrote but who got the E wrong." He pointed. "Here, the loop goes the wrong direction." Augusta leaned forward and looked. She had seen Thomas sign his name hundreds of times. The loop did go the wrong direction. "My God," she said quietly. "Beyond the signature question," Hale continued, "I have a sworn statement from Orrin Bowles, the Wichita notary who was asked to authenticate this document in January of this year and refused. He wrote in his notation book that the signature presented appeared inconsistent with a known sample he possessed, and he declined to notarize. Vance's lawyers apparently then took it to a different notary in a different town, one with less careful habits. "Who forged it?" Wallace said. He had been sitting back slightly, letting Hale present, but his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who was holding something carefully. "I believe Vance had someone do it for her. Whether she did it herself or commissioned it, she knew. The debt itself, I went through every financial record Thomas gave me access to, and there is no evidence that he ever borrowed money from Dorothea Vance or had any financial entanglement with her. They were acquainted in his youth before he came to Kansas. She appears to have decided after his death that a fraudulent claim against his estate was worth attempting. She waited until I was alone," Augusta said. "It was not a question." Hale met her eyes. "I believe that is the correct reading of the timing, yes." She looked at the documents on the table. The betrayal of it, not Thomas's betrayal, but Vance's cold, calculated targeting of a widow with a child, settled into her chest like something that would take a long time to fully metabolize. "She waited until she thought I had no one to fight for me," Augusta said. She did not look at Wallace, but she was aware of him in her peripheral vision, solid and present, and she felt the truth of the counterargument to Vance's calculation settling around her like armor. Dorothea Vance had miscalculated. The morning of the hearing, Augusta dressed carefully. She chose the dark navy dress with the small white collar that she had worn to the county business meetings when Thomas was alive, and she had sat beside him as his partner in everything. She pinned her dark hair back neatly. She wore no jewelry except her wedding ring, which she had not removed and was not going to remove, because it represented something separate from grief. It represented her legal standing as Thomas's widow, his heir, the rightful owner of every acre that Vance was attempting to steal. Daniel was already awake when she came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of bread, and his serious, dark-eyed look that was so like her own it sometimes startled her. "Are you going to keep the ranch, Mama?" he asked. She sat across from him. "Yes," she said, "I am." She believed it because she had to believe it, and also because she had looked at the forged deed herself and seen the wrongness in the E, and because Frank Hale had the notary's sworn statement in his briefcase, and because Wallace had ridden 70 miles in 2 days to make sure she had what she needed. She walked Daniel to the Corbett house, where Millie Corbett received him with the particular warmth of a woman who understood what was at stake without needing it explained. And then Augusta walked the 3 blocks to the courthouse in the bright March morning with her head up and her steps measured. And she did not let herself run even though every instinct was urging her forward. She found Wallace outside the courthouse. He was in his Sunday coat, dark brown wool that fit him well across the shoulders, and his hat was clean. He looked at her when she came up the steps, and something passed across his face that she filed away to examine later. "Hale's already inside," he said. "Vance's lawyer arrived 20 minutes ago. She's in there too." "How does she look?" "Confident," he said, which is what people look like when they don't yet know what's coming. There was a small, brief smile between them, and it was the first time in weeks that Augusta had felt anything that resembled lightness. Inside, the courtroom was already filling. Redemption Creek was not a large town, perhaps 350 souls, but it had a healthy appetite for significant legal matters, and the dispute over the Easton homestead had been the principal subject of conversation for 3 weeks. People arrived early and found seats on the wooden benches or positions along the wall. Augusta noticed the bank president, the hardware store owner, the pastor from the Methodist church, half a dozen ranchers from the surrounding valley, all of them watching her as she walked to the plaintiff's side of the room. Dorothea Vance was already seated at the other table. Up close, in the morning light, she was perhaps 35, handsome in a deliberate way, with very steady eyes that she turned on Augusta with a look that contained no apology whatsoever. Augusta met the look and held it long enough to establish that she was not going to be the one who looked away first, and then she directed her attention to Frank Hale, who was laying out documents with his characteristic precision. The hearing began at 9 in the morning. Judge Hollis called the room to order, and established the nature of the proceeding, a competing claim hearing under Kansas territorial law to determine the validity of a deed presented by one Dorothea Vance against the standing patent deed registered to the estate of the late Thomas Easton, now administered by his widow, Augusta Easton. Vance's lawyer went first. He was smooth and confident and built his argument with careful bricks. The relationship between Thomas Easton and Dorothea Vance, the alleged debt of $11,000, the execution of the deed as satisfaction of that debt, the notarization, the legal principle that private debts could create obligations against property. He held the deed up and presented it to the judge with the manner of a man presenting a certainty. Then Frank Hale stood up. He began, in his quiet and methodical way, to dismantle everything. He presented the signature comparisons first. He had the 3 authenticated examples mounted side by side with the disputed signature, and he walked Judge Hollis through the specific inconsistencies, the particular way the loop descended, the spacing of the letters. He did not use dramatic language. He did not need to. The evidence was plain. Augusta watched the judge's face while Hale spoke and saw the moment when Hollis understood what he was looking at. Then Hale called Orrin Bowles. The Wichita notary had made the trip himself rather than simply submitting a written statement, which Augusta suspected was Wallace's doing. He had gone to Dodge City, and she believed he had also made arrangements regarding Bowles, though he had not detailed those arrangements to her, and she had not pushed. Bowles was a small, dry, careful man who spoke in the precise manner of someone who had spent 30 years caring very much about whether things were correct. He described being approached in January 1883 to notarize the deed in question. He described his review of the signature. He described opening his notation book to a letter he had received from Thomas Easton 18 months prior regarding an unrelated property matter, a letter which contained Thomas's authenticated signature. He described comparing the 2 signatures and finding an inconsistency he could not reconcile. He described declining to notarize the document and noting his reasons in his official record, which he had brought with him and which he now presented to the court. Vance's lawyer cross-examined him hard for 20 minutes, but Bowles was unshakable because he was simply describing what he had seen and recorded at the time. He had nothing to gain or lose from the outcome of the hearing. He was a notary who had declined to authenticate a document because the signature was wrong, and that was all he was. Hale then entered Frank's own correspondence with Thomas into evidence. The letters in which Thomas had described Vance's claim as fraudulent, had identified it as stemming from a dark past acquaintance he wanted no further connection to, and had explicitly stated that he had never borrowed money from Dorothea Vance and had no legal obligation toward her. Dead men cannot testify. But letters, written in Thomas Easton's own hand, in the months before his death, describing exactly this situation and identifying it as a trap, those letters sat in the record with the weight of testimony. The courtroom had grown very quiet. That was when Dorothea Vance's lawyer asked for a brief recess. He came back from that recess without his previous confidence. He made several additional arguments, but they had the quality of a man throwing objects from a sinking vessel. Each one disappeared without making much difference. Vance herself sat very still and said nothing, and Augusta was aware that the woman's composure was being maintained through considerable effort. Judge Hollis called for final statements. Hale made his final statement, which was brief and devastating, and then the room waited. It was during that waiting, those minutes when Hollis made notes and reviewed documents, and the courtroom held its collective breath, that Augusta heard a commotion near the door and turned to see one of Vance's associates, a young man who had been fetching and carrying for the lawyer all morning, push through the crowd with a fresh document in his hand and a look of urgent purpose. He made it to the front of the room and handed the document to Vance's lawyer, who scanned it rapidly and immediately requested permission to introduce new evidence. Hollis looked up from his notes. "On what basis?" "On the basis that this is a second deed," the lawyer said, executed at a later date under different terms and bearing a notarization from the county of Sumner, Kansas in August of 1881. The room started talking all at once. Augusta felt the ground tilt again. Hale was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is the first we have heard of any second document, as it is for us as well," Vance's lawyer said smoothly. "This document was located among Miss Vance's personal effects by her associate just this morning. It predates our client's awareness that the first deed would be challenged on signature grounds." Hollis took the document. He read it. His face remained very still. It was a second deed, or something that looked like a deed, describing a transaction between Thomas Easton and Dorothea Vance executed in August 1881, after the patent issuance, for the same property under the same terms. Augusta looked at Hale. Hale's expression was that of a man processing information very rapidly. Then Wallace moved from the wall. He was at the front of the room before anyone fully registered that he had decided to move. He picked up the document from the judge's desk with one hand. Hollis made a sound of protest. Vance's lawyer started forward. Wallace Ramsey tore the document straight down the middle. He let both halves fall to the floor. The silence was absolute and immediate and complete. "That document," he said, "is a forgery." He looked at Judge Hollis. "And I can prove it." Judge Hollis was a man who had considerable judicial dignity, and on a normal day would have responded to the destruction of evidence before his bench with considerable judicial fury. He drew himself up to his full seated height and opened his mouth, and Wallace spoke first. "Your Honor, that document bears Thomas Easton's signature and purports to be dated August 1881. I have in my coat pocket a letter written by Thomas Easton to me personally, dated September of 1881, in which he mentions specifically that he has been dealing with fraudulent attempts to attach claims to his property, and that he is relieved to report that his attorney believes the situation is under control. He does not name Vance in this letter, but this letter is dated 1 month after the date on that document." He drew the letter from his coat. "If Thomas had willingly executed a deed transferring his property in August 1881, he would not have written to me in September 1881 describing ongoing fraudulent claims against his property as a problem he was still fighting." Hollis looked at the torn halves on the floor. He looked at the letter Wallace was extending to him. He looked at Vance's lawyer, who had opened his mouth and closed it again. "Furthermore," Wallace said, "that notarization from Sumner County bears the seal of a notary named Clement Briggs. I know Clement Briggs. He died in a fire in February of 1882. He cannot corroborate this notarization, and his death preceded this legal proceeding by over a year, which is a considerable coincidence for a document that Miss Vance's associate located this very morning." The room erupted. Hale was on his feet, adding to Wallace's statements, building the legal framework around what Wallace had laid out instinctively. Vance's lawyer was talking over him. Two people on the benches were talking to each other in urgent undertones. Hollis was banging his gavel with increasing force. Augusta was watching Wallace, who had not moved, who was still standing in the middle of the floor with Thomas's letter in his hand, with the two halves of the false deed at his feet, with his shoulders squared and his chin level, and the particular stillness of a man who has said the thing he needed to say, and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. She thought he carried that letter with him. He had been carrying that letter in his coat pocket in case he needed it. He had known it might not be enough to simply present the evidence they had prepared. He had kept a reserve. He had planned for the possibility of surprise. The gavel came down hard enough to make the lamp rattle. "Order," Judge Hollis said, with enough force to actually produce it. "Order in this room. Now." Silence assembled itself reluctantly. "Mr. Ramsey," Hollis said, "you have destroyed evidence before this court, which is a serious matter that I will address separately. However," he paused, and the pause was a long one that made everyone in the room very attentive. "The points you have raised will be entered into the record, and the letter you have produced will be submitted as exhibit." He looked at Vance's lawyer. "Counselor, I suggest you consult with your client." The recess lasted 45 minutes. Augusta stood outside the courthouse in the pale March sunshine with Wallace and Frank Hale. Hale was quiet in the way of someone who was already constructing arguments. Augusta was quiet in the way of someone who was waiting for the next thing to try to take her under, because the last 3 weeks had taught her that things kept coming. Wallace stood beside her without speaking for a long moment, and then he said, "How are you holding up?" Thought about giving him the easy answer. "I'm terrified," she said instead, "and furious, and I keep thinking about Daniel and whether I made the right choice of words in there and whether Hollis is going to see it clearly and what I do if he doesn't." Wallace turned to look at her. "He'll see it clearly," he said. "Hollis is a good judge. He's old and cautious, but he's honest. An honest judge with this evidence will come out in the right place." "You can't know that." "No," he admitted, "but I believe it." She looked at him for a moment. The March light was clean and thin, and it caught the lines of his face in a way that she was aware of in more detail than was perhaps useful at this particular moment. "You carried that letter in your pocket," she said. "Thomas's September letter." He was quiet. "How long have you had it?" "Since he wrote it," Wallace said. "He wrote it and then he died before he could follow up, and I kept it because it felt important. I didn't know what it was important for. I know now." "You've been planning this." "I've been paying attention," he said. "There's a difference, though maybe not a large one." She thought about all the ways a person could love someone without saying so directly. She thought about letters carried in pockets against contingency. She thought about 70-mile rides and carefully maintained boundaries, and a man who had been standing along the wall of her life for months, quietly making sure that nothing fell apart. She thought, "I am not ready for this." She also thought, "I have been ready for this for longer than I know how to admit." Neither of those thoughts produced any useful action in the next 40 minutes, which were occupied entirely by the return to the courthouse and the final resolution of the legal matter. When Vance's lawyer came back from the recess, he came back without his confidence and with a request. He asked the judge for permission to withdraw the second deed from evidence and to acknowledge that its authenticity was disputed. Hollis permitted it. Then he delivered his ruling on the original deed, which was the one Wallace had torn, and he delivered it in the measured and thorough voice of a judge who wanted his reasoning clearly in the record. He found that the signature inconsistencies identified by Attorney Hale and confirmed by Notary Orrin Bowles constituted substantial and credible evidence of forgery. He found that Thomas Easton's written correspondence to his attorney, identifying Vance's claim as fraudulent, constituted material evidence of the landowner's intent. He found that there was no independent corroboration of any legitimate debt between Thomas Easton and Dorothea Vance. He dismissed the competing claim in its entirety. He then turned to the question of Wallace Ramsey's destruction of court documents. He looked at Wallace over his spectacles for a long moment. "Mr. Ramsey," he said, "you destroyed evidence before this bench. I have half a mind to hold you in contempt. However, given that the document in question was a forgery, and given that your destruction of it was accompanied by a statement of verifiable fact that materially aided the court's determination, I am going to exercise judicial discretion and note your conduct in the record as both irregular and ultimately in service of truth." He paused. "Do not do it again." "No, sir," Wallace said. "I mean ever," Hollis said. "In any courthouse." "Understood, Your Honor." Dorothea Vance left the courthouse in Redemption Creek on that Monday morning and was gone from town by evening. Her lawyer departed on the same stage. Whatever conversation had passed between them in the recess, Augusta never learned, but she observed on Vance's face as the woman rose from her chair and turned toward the door a particular expression, not shame exactly, but the tightening of a person who has calculated wrongly and knows it. Vance did not look at Augusta as she left. Augusta chose not to call her back. There were some forms of justice that were complete enough without additional confrontation. The courthouse emptied gradually, and Augusta found herself in the spring afternoon outside on the steps, receiving congratulations from half the town of Redemption Creek in the warm and slightly dazed manner of someone who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of it is its own kind of shock. Millie Corbett pressed both her hands and looked at her with bright eyes. Frank Hale shook her hand with his characteristic professional warmth and said he would have the paperwork sorted within the week. The bank president told her that the ranch's good standing with the bank had never been in question, which she was fairly certain was not entirely true, but was generous to say. She picked up Daniel from the Corbett's house at 4 in the afternoon. He came running down the front path with his dark hair loose from its morning neatness, and a streak of what appeared to be jam on his cheek, and a look on his face that asked the question before he could form the words. "We won," Augusta said, and caught him as he launched himself at her. She held her son with her eyes closed and breathed in the hay-in child smell of him and felt, for the first time in 9 months, something that might have been the beginning of peace. That evening she sat on the porch of the ranch house with a cup of tea that went cold in her hands and watched the sun go down over the western grasslands in the long, lingering way it went down in March, painting everything orange and copper and the particular gold of new grass. The ranch was hers. The water rights were hers. The soil where Thomas was buried was hers to tend. Daniel was asleep inside, having eaten 2 portions of supper and fallen asleep mid-sentence at the table, which she had counted as a personal victory. She heard a horse coming down the lane and knew, before she could see who it was, that it was Wallace. He came up to the porch and swung down from the saddle and tied the reins to the post and came up the 3 steps without invitation, which was the kind of social familiarity that had developed between them so gradually and so naturally that she was not even sure when it had started. He had been on this porch perhaps 50 times. He sat down in the second chair without asking, and she did not move to offer him tea or anything else, and for several minutes they simply sat and watched the last of the sun go out over the grass. "You should have told me you had that letter," she said eventually, not angry, just stating. "I wasn't sure I needed it," he said. "I didn't want to give you one more thing to hold on to before the hearing." She considered that. It was the kind of decision she might have made herself, the careful rationing of information to prevent additional anxiety. She understood it even as she noted that it was, again, a form of protection extended without explicit permission. "You're a lot like him," she said, "in some ways." He was quiet for a moment. "I know. That's not a criticism. I know that too." She turned to look at him in the fading light. He was looking at the grasslands, his profile clean and still, his hat hanging from one knee. He had removed his Sunday coat sometime between the courthouse and now and was back in his working clothes, and the particular comfort of seeing him like this, not formal, not performing anything, just present, settled something in her. "Why did you come out here tonight?" she asked. He turned to look at her. "Because I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "And because the alternative was going back to the bunkhouse and sitting with my thoughts, and I've been doing that since December of last year and it's not productive." Something about the particular directness of that made her breath catch. "December," she said. "The night Thomas died," he said. "I came and sat with him for the last hour. You were on the other side of the bed. You didn't see me come in. You were holding his hand." He paused. "I watched you hold yourself together for the next 6 hours after he was gone. You organized everything. You talked to the doctor. You sent word to Thomas's family. You checked on Daniel. You did not fall apart once." He looked at her steadily. "And something happened in me that night that I have spent the last 3 months trying to be reasonable about." Augusta set down her cold tea. She said, "Wallace, I'm not asking you to do anything," he said. "I'm not going to say something I shouldn't say. I just wanted you to know that the reason I rode to Dodge City, and the reason I carried that letter, and the reason I tore that piece of paper in half in front of the judge is not uncomplicated, and you deserve to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. The night was coming on around them, soft and full of cricket sound, and the last glow of the sun was just a thread of copper along the western horizon. She said, "I'm not finished grieving Thomas." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be." "I don't know what I feel," she said. "I'm telling you that honestly. I know that I depend on you in ways that I think about more than I probably should. I know that the last 3 weeks would have been different without you and not in a direction I want to think about, but I don't know what that is yet." "It doesn't have to be anything yet," he said. "That's a true thing I'm saying, not a strategic thing." She looked at him for another moment, measuring the truth of it against what she knew of his character, and found that it held. "All right," she said. He nodded. They sat on the porch for another hour in the spring dark, talking about nothing in particular: the condition of the south fence line, the price of cattle at the spring market, whether Daniel's talent for getting into trouble was a permanent feature or something he might grow through, and Augusta felt, in the easy ordinariness of that conversation, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like herself, not the widow, not the woman defending her land, not the person braced for the next difficulty. Just herself in her own body on her own porch in her own dark, talking to a man whose company she valued in ways that had no reason to be anything other than what they plainly were. When he left, he paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "Augusta." She looked at him from the doorway. "Sleep," he said. "Just sleep. Everything else can be figured out in the daylight." She smiled, and it was a full smile, and she was not entirely sure when she had last made one of those. "Good night, Wallace," she said. Spring moved into the valley of Redemption Creek with the particular insistence of a season that has been delayed too long. The grass came up green and thick along the Callow Creek banks, and the cattle put on weight with the speed of animals who have survived winter and know it. Augusta threw herself into the work of the ranch with a focus that was partly genuine industry and partly the useful quality of hard physical labor to organize the mind. She hired 2 ranch hands, brothers named Pete and Carl Dolan, who came recommended by 3 separate people, and who proved to be steady workers with the particular quiet competence of men who understood cattle. She repaired the equipment that had been deferred through the winter. She rebuilt the section of fence along the eastern boundary that had been damaged in the December floods. She did the accounts. She paid the bills. She also, because she was honest with herself, paid careful attention to the way the world looked when Wallace was in it. He was in it frequently. His work at the Caldwell Ranch bordered hers on the north and west, and the practical business of neighboring ranches in close country created natural occasions for interaction. He helped her sort the new calves in April. She brought food to the Caldwell Ranch in May when 3 of Caldwell's hands went down with a fever in the same week, and the cook was among the sick. They met at the spring cattle market in Dodge City and talked prices and breeding stock and the relative merits of various approaches to the fall drive. They sat at the same table at the Founders' Day supper in June, and Daniel sat between them eating an alarming quantity of corn bread and telling Wallace very seriously about a rabbit he had found under the porch. Augusta watched Wallace listen to the rabbit story with complete attention and felt something move in her chest that she no longer tried to name as something other than what it was. On a Sunday evening in late June, when the days were at their longest and the heat came off the grassland in sweet waves that smelled like dust and wildflowers, Wallace asked her if she would like to take a walk with him along the creek. He did not frame it as anything specific. He said it with the careful casualness of a man who has thought about how to say a thing for some time and has settled on simplicity. She said yes. The walk along Callow Creek in the last of the June light was one of those evenings that seems, while it is happening, to be assembling itself into memory even before it is over. The water was low and clear over the stones, making its quiet sound, and the cottonwoods along the bank were in full leaf, throwing a dappled shade that moved in the warm evening wind. They walked without hurrying, side by side but not touching, and they talked in the way that people talk when they are no longer performing ease but have simply found it. He told her about his own history, about growing up in Missouri, about coming west at 19, with a friend who had persuaded him that cattle work in Kansas was a surer future than the tenant farming his father had managed. About the years of ranch work before he had found his current position with the Caldwell outfit, about the things he had seen and the places he had been, about the woman he had been close to years ago in Abilene, who had married someone else and whom he had recovered from, and who now felt like a chapter of a book that he had set down and moved past without regret. "I haven't talked about her in a long time," he said. "I wanted you to know she existed, because it seemed dishonest not to." "Why dishonest?" Augusta asked. "Because it means I know what it feels like to want something and not have it," he said. "And I'm not approaching you from a position of having no idea what any of this costs." She looked at him. "That was a very carefully thought-out thing to say," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and the sound of it surprised her into laughing too, and in that moment the last of the careful distance between them simply dissolved. She told him about Thomas. Not the cleaned-up version, not the version she had given to neighbors and relatives in the months following his death, but the real version, the love that had been genuine and the frustrations that had also been genuine. The way Thomas had been magnificent and also occasionally maddening. The particular grief of loving someone you also sometimes disagreed with, and then losing them before the disagreements could be fully resolved. The guilt of being angry at a dead man. The work of separating that guilt from the grief so that she could carry them differently. Wallace listened without interrupting, without rushing to comfort or correct, without offering a single one of the platitudes she had heard from a dozen well-meaning people in the past 9 months. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and without agenda, and when she finished he said simply, "Thank you for telling me that. Most people want the simpler version," she said. "Most people aren't paying sufficient attention," he said. They stood by the creek for a while after that, not talking, just watching the water, and the evening settled around them soft and golden. And Augusta was aware that something was resolving in her, not closing, not shutting anything away, but resolving in the way a chord resolves, finding its right note. She reached over and took his hand. He didn't move for a moment, as if registering the reality of it. Then he turned his hand and held hers, and they stood by the creek in the June dark and the sound of the water. And Augusta felt the complicated truth of it, that she was a widow, that Thomas was gone, that grief was real and permanent and did not disappear, and also felt, coexisting with all of that without contradiction, something that was warm and solid and facing forward. She said, "I'm not going to rush into anything." "No," he said. "But I don't want to pretend I don't know what this is." "Neither do I." She looked at him in the fading light. He looked back. "Then we don't pretend," she said. "We don't pretend," he agreed. Summer in western Kansas was not a gentle thing. It came in hard and bright and testing. The sky an enormous blue weight above the grasslands. The sun extracting its toll in sweat and dust, and the particular exhaustion of long days that began before dawn and did not end until after dark. Augusta worked her ranch with the 2 Dahlin brothers and a seasonal hand she took on in July. A steady older man named Henry Pratt, who had been ranching in the territory for 20 years, and who managed the cattle operation with the unruffled expertise of someone who had seen every possible thing go wrong, and had developed a procedure for all of it. With Henry and the Dahlins in place, the ranch functioned as it needed to. Augusta found herself able to think beyond the immediate demands of daily survival for the first time since Thomas's death, found herself able to look at the ranch as a going concern, rather than a disaster to be continuously forestalled. She and Wallace found a rhythm. There was nothing formal declared between them, no public announcement, no particular moment of ceremony, but the people of Redemption Creek read situations with the accuracy of people who live in close proximity to their neighbors and have limited entertainment. And within 2 months of the courthouse hearing, it was generally understood that Augusta Easton and Wallace Ramsey were keeping company, which the town received with a range of opinions from enthusiastic approval to moderate concern about the appropriate speed of such things, with the distribution of opinion correlating closely with how much each person had liked Thomas. Most people had liked Thomas. Most of those people also, after a while, came around to the view that Augusta was a practical woman who had been through a great deal and was entitled to her own happiness on her own timeline, and that Wallace Ramsey was a known quantity in Redemption Creek, whose character had been publicly demonstrated rather dramatically in a courthouse the previous March. Millie Corbett told Augusta, over tea in September, that Wallace had spoken to the bank president about investment in a property adjoining the Caldwell Ranch, which suggested to Millie that he was thinking about his own future in terms of roots rather than movement. Augusta filed this information without comment, though she felt its warmth. Daniel, for his part, had already made his determination. He had made it sometime in April, silently and without announcement, the way 7-year-olds make decisions based on observation, instinct, and the single criterion of whether someone was interesting to be around. Wallace passed this criterion on the grounds that he knew things about horses and cattle and rope tricks, and the names of the constellations, all of which were things Daniel considered essential knowledge. By midsummer, Daniel had developed the habit of appearing at the fence line between the properties on weekend mornings to see if Wallace was around, and Wallace had developed the corresponding habit of being around, and Augusta had watched this arrangement establish itself with the particular helplessness of a person observing something inevitable. One afternoon in September, she came out to the barn to find Wallace teaching Daniel to splice a rope with the patient thoroughness of someone who believed a 7-year-old was perfectly capable of learning anything if you explained it clearly enough. Daniel's tongue was between his teeth with concentration. Wallace's large hands moved slowly, demonstrating. Neither of them noticed her immediately, and she stood in the barn doorway and looked at them in the slant September light and felt something so large and so simple that she could not immediately contain it. Daniel looked up. "Mama, look, Wallace is teaching me to splice rope." "I see that," she said. Wallace looked up too, and their eyes met over Daniel's head, and what passed between them in that moment required no translation. In October, Wallace asked Augusta to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He did not orchestrate a public moment or acquire symbolic props beyond a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, which he had carried from Missouri, and kept for 12 years in the bottom of a small box with no expectation attached to it until recently. He asked her on the porch of her ranch house on an October evening when Daniel was asleep, and the air had the particular cold clarity of early fall and the stars were very bright. He said, "I know the timing of this question might seem fast to some people," she said. "It's been almost 8 months since the courthouse." "It has," he said, "and longer than that for me." She was quiet. "I love you," he said, with the simplicity of a man who has considered the statement sufficiently to know it is accurate. "I love your son. I love this ranch and what you've built here and what you're still building. I want to build something alongside it and alongside you if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I need to ask you something first." "Ask." "If Thomas had lived," she said carefully, "if none of this had happened, would you have said anything?" He thought about it honestly because that was the kind of man he was. "No," he said, "I wouldn't have. He was your husband and my neighbor and an honest man, and I would have kept my mouth shut and worked my land and found a way to be content." She nodded. "But he didn't live," she said, not as an accusation, just as the fact that it was. "No," he said. She looked at the stars for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, Wallace." He was quiet for half a second, as if his mind needed to register it. "Yes," she repeated and smiled. And the smile was the full one, the unguarded one, the one she had been saving up since March. He reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and they sat together on the porch in the October cold while the stars turned slowly overhead, and Augusta felt Thomas somewhere in the quality of the night, not as a reproach, not as a barrier, but as the particular kind of presence that departed people maintain in the places they loved, witnessing without interference the continuation of the world they left behind. She thought, "Be at peace, Thomas." She thought it as gently as she could, and she believed he received it the same way. They were married in the Methodist Church of Redemption Creek on the first Saturday of December 1883, which was exactly 1 year after Thomas Easton had died of the lung fever that had taken him faster than anyone expected. Augusta had been deliberate about the date. It was not morbid, she felt. It was honest. It acknowledged the full truth of the timeline without pretending any part of it away. She had discussed it with the pastor and with Wallace and with her own conscience, and had found that it felt right in the way that things feel right when they are made from truth rather than from the desire to appear uncomplicated. The church was full. Redemption Creek was not a town that missed weddings, and this particular wedding had the additional quality of concluding a story that everyone had been watching since March, when the deed had been torn in half and the widow's claim on her land had been vindicated, and the foreman from the Caldwell Ranch had made it abundantly clear, in the middle of a courtroom, that he was not a man who would stand by while something unjust happened if he had any means of preventing it. Augusta wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding month from a deep green wool that her mother had sent from Lawrence when she heard the news. It was not a traditional bridal white. She had not worn white for her first wedding either, and she saw no reason to start now, but it was beautiful, fitted to her precisely, with a small collar of ivory lace that had been her grandmother's. Daniel stood at the front of the church beside Wallace during the ceremony, not because it had been formally arranged, but because when they had arrived at the church and taken their positions, Daniel had simply walked up to stand beside Wallace and Wallace had put a hand on his shoulder, and that had been that. The pastor read the service with the appropriate gravity and warmth. Wallace held her hands and said the words directly to her, not at the ceiling, not at the middle distance, but to her, and the steadiness of his eyes on hers during those words was the most certain thing she had ever experienced. She said the words back. They exchanged the ring. The ring fit. The reception was held in the community hall with tables of food contributed by half the women of the town, a fiddle player and a guitar player, who were not individually remarkable, but produced together a sound that was irresistible to the dancing instinct, and a cake that Millie Corbett had made herself, and presented with the expression of someone offering their best work. Augusta danced with Wallace on the cleared floor of the community hall with 30 people watching, and found that she did not care in the slightest about the watching, because she was dancing with her husband on the first Saturday of December, and the fiddle was playing, and Daniel was spinning in circles with Henry Pratt's granddaughter nearby, laughing at something, his dark hair flying, and the sight of it was the most complete joy she had felt in a very long time. Wallace leaned down and said against her hair, "Are you happy?" She leaned back far enough to look at him. "Remarkably," she said. He smiled, and it was the unguarded version of his smile, the one she had been collecting for months, and it went all the way to his eyes in a way that was only available to people who were not performing anything. "Good," he said. "I intend to maintain that." She laughed. They danced. The winter after the wedding was the kind of winter the plains could produce when they were disposed toward gentleness, cold, yes, and snowy in January, but manageable, the kind of cold that required warmth rather than mere endurance. Augusta and Wallace ran the ranch together from the beginning with a natural partnership that neither of them had to manufacture, because the mutual respect and practical understanding between them had been established long before the ring was exchanged. Wallace had dissolved his employment with the Caldwell Ranch upon the announcement of the engagement, having previously arranged to purchase a 40-acre parcel adjacent to Augusta's land from old Caldwell himself, who was in his late 60s and in the process of reducing his operation. The combined properties gave them a holding of 360 acres, which was a sound basis for the future they were building. They put the two Dahlin brothers on regular wages and kept Henry Pratt on for the spring and fall work. They made improvements to the ranch house through the winter months, Wallace was a capable carpenter, which Augusta had not previously known, and which she discovered when he appeared one Saturday morning with lumber and a plan for expanding the kitchen that he had drawn out on paper with the careful precision of a man who had been thinking about it for some time. The kitchen expansion took 3 weekends and produced a room that doubled the working space and added a south-facing window that filled the room with winter light in the mornings. Augusta stood in the finished kitchen on the morning it was complete and ran her hand along the new windowsill and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing built with care to last. "You're good at this," she said. Wallace was cleaning sawdust from his hands. "My father built his own house. He taught me what he knew." "Your father was a wise man. He was practical," Wallace said. "He said useful skills are the ones that stay with you when everything else leaves." She thought about that. "That's true," she said. "I wish I'd known him." He looked at her across the new kitchen, and the look was warm and a little wondering, the way people look when someone says something that matters to them. "He would have liked you," he said. Spring came back to Redemption Creek with the particular insistence of a season that has decided to make a statement. April was spectacular, 3 weeks of warm rain followed by sunshine that brought the grass up green and deep across the whole valley, and the wildflowers came out along Callow Creek in such abundance that Daniel picked a large and chaotic bouquet and presented it to Augusta with the serious formality of a child conducting an important ceremony. She put them in the blue pitcher on the kitchen table and looked at them every morning for the week it took them to fade. In May, Augusta told Wallace that she was expecting. He was in the barn when she told him, mending a saddle with the focused attention he brought to all practical work. And when she said the words, he set the saddle down and looked at her for a moment with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. Not surprise, exactly, though there was that, but something more like the look of a person confronted with a happiness, so full it temporarily removes the capacity for speech. Then he crossed the barn and put his arms around her and held her in the particular careful way of a man who is trying to express something that words won't contain. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, nothing alarming." He leaned back and looked at her. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. He laughed the full, unguarded laugh, and she felt it as much as heard it, his whole chest moving. Daniel received the news with the thoughtful gravity of an 8-year-old processing a significant change to his understanding of the world. He was quiet for half a day, and then came to find Augusta in the kitchen to ask whether the baby would be a boy or a girl. "We don't know yet," she said. "Not until it arrives." "I think it should be a boy," Daniel said, with the authority of someone who has considered the matter, "so I can teach him things." "You could teach a girl things too," Augusta pointed out. Daniel considered this. "I suppose," he allowed, with the tone of someone making a significant concession. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Augusta worked the ranch with appropriate adjustments. She let the Dahlin brothers take on more of the physically demanding work, and she managed the accounts and the supply ordering and the correspondence with buyers and the 100 administrative details that were the invisible labor of running a working ranch. Wallace was attentive without being smothering, which she appreciated, because she had not stopped being herself and had no intention of doing so. She was aware, through that summer, of a particular quality in the life she was living, not the absence of difficulty, because difficulty was simply the baseline condition of ranching in the Western Territories, but the presence of something underneath the difficulty that held constant. She woke every morning to the same man sleeping beside her, which was something she had not taken for granted since December, and which she did not intend to start taking for granted now. She heard Daniel in the mornings before they did, usually the particular sound of him getting up and moving through the house, investigating, making small necessary boy noises, and then Wallace, unhurried and deliberate, and then herself. 3 people in a house that had been just 2 for too long. Wallace was different with Daniel than Thomas had been, which was not a criticism of Thomas but a simple truth. Thomas had loved his son with an intensity that was sometimes more about his own investment in Daniel's future than about Daniel's present experience. Wallace loved Daniel in a more immediate way, in the rope splicing and the stargazing and the patient sitting through rabbit stories. And Daniel, who at 8 was old enough to know the difference without being able to articulate it, had responded to this with the wholehearted trust of a child who recognizes something genuine. One evening in July, Daniel told Wallace that he was glad about the way things had turned out. Wallace looked at him. I miss my father," Daniel said, with the directness of a child who has learned to hold complex things in both hands. "But I'm glad about now." "Me too," Wallace said. "Do you think my father would have liked you?" Daniel asked. Wallace was quiet for a moment. Augusta, from the kitchen doorway where she was listening, held very still. "I think he would have taken some convincing," Wallace said honestly. "But I hope so." Daniel nodded, accepting this, and went back to whatever he had been doing with the rope. Augusta pressed her palm to the doorframe and breathed. The baby arrived on the 3rd day of November 1884, when the first frost had already laid itself across the Callow Creek Valley, and the world smelled of cold earth and dried grass, and the particular clean bite of approaching winter. It was a boy. He arrived in the small hours of the morning with the assistance of the town midwife, a sturdy and competent woman named Ruth Baker, who had delivered most of the babies in Redemption Creek for the last 15 years, and who treated the whole business with the brisk warmth of someone who loves their work. Wallace was present in the room, which was not a universal practice for the time and place, but which he had simply assumed without discussion, and Augusta had been grateful for him there, his hand, his steady presence, the calm he produced in a room simply by being in it. She held the baby for the first time in the gray pre-dawn light and looked at his red, indignant, extraordinary face, and felt the enormous specific love that arrives with new children, different from every other love, contained to itself, impossible to anticipate until it happens. Wallace sat beside her on the edge of the bed. He looked at the baby. He looked at Augusta. He put his arm around her carefully, mindful of her exhaustion and her tenderness, and she leaned into him. "Hello," he said to the baby in the quiet voice of a man addressing someone important. The baby blinked. "What should we name him?" Augusta asked. They had discussed names before, had come up with several possibilities on both sides, had argued cheerfully about one or two, had reached a tentative agreement that had felt like a good direction without being an absolute commitment. "Thomas," Wallace said. She looked at him. "Not Thomas Ramsey," he said. "Thomas Easton Ramsey, both names." She looked at him for a long time, in the early morning light of the room where their son had just been born, and the thing she felt was not sadness, though grief was present in it, and not simply happiness, though happiness was the largest component. It was the feeling of someone being seen and honored by a person who has understood them well enough to know what the right thing is and do it without being asked. "Thomas Easton Ramsey," she said. The baby, as if he recognized the name or simply the quality of the moment, made a small sound that might have been agreement. Daniel came in at first light and stood at the edge of the room in his nightclothes with enormous eyes, and Augusta beckoned him over and he came and stood very close and looked at his brother with the expression of someone revising all their previous expectations. "He's very small," Daniel said. "He'll grow," Augusta said. "Teach him things," Daniel said with renewed confidence. He looked at Wallace. "Can I hold him?" "Tomorrow," Wallace said, "when you've had your breakfast and your mother has rested." Daniel accepted this with only minor negotiation. The town of Redemption Creek received the news of Thomas Easton Ramsey's arrival with the particular warmth that small western towns reserved for continuations, new lives, new names, the evidence that the project of settlement was carrying forward. Millie Corbett brought food. The pastor sent a note. Half a dozen neighboring families came by in the first 2 weeks with gifts and good wishes. Frank Hale, who had returned to Dodge City after the courthouse victory, but with whom Augusta had maintained a friendly correspondence, sent a short letter of congratulation that made her laugh. Augusta recovered from the birth with the resilience of a woman who had been doing hard physical work for years and whose body was accustomed to meeting demands. By December, she was back to managing the ranch accounts, and by January, she was fully involved in all the ranch operations again. Tom, as he had already become known, a shortened name that had arrived spontaneously and stuck immediately on a blanket nearby while she worked at the kitchen table. Life on the Easton Ramsey Ranch settled into the full, demanding, deeply satisfying rhythm of a working agricultural life in the final years of the Kansas frontier. Seasons turned. The cattle operation expanded. A second barn went up in the spring of 1885, larger than the first, with a better loft and attack room that Wallace designed with his characteristic practical thoroughness. Augusta planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that became, over successive seasons, one of the most productive in the valley. Daniel grew with the speed of boys who are actively applying themselves to becoming people. He was 10, 11, 12, serious and curious, and occasionally exasperating in the way of children who have more questions than the adults around them have time to answer. He took to the ranch work with genuine ability. He had Thomas's spatial intelligence and Wallace's patience, which was a combination that produced someone who could figure out what needed to be done and then actually do it. And Wallace worked alongside him with the care of someone who understood that teaching is itself a form of love. There were difficulties, because there were always difficulties. A drought in 1886 that reduced the grass and required emergency feed purchases. A dispute with a neighboring rancher over a water access point on the creek that required 3 months of negotiation before a fair agreement was reached. A winter fever that went through the whole family in January 1887 and left Augusta and both boys miserable for 2 weeks, while Wallace managed the ranch essentially alone and tended the invalids with a competence that suggested he had done this before. A fire in the spring of 1887 that took a corner of the barn and was contained quickly enough to prevent worse loss, but left a mark in the wood and in their awareness of how quickly things could change. Through all of it, the thing that held was the thing that had been established with such care: the partnership, the honesty, the willingness to say difficult things in direct words. They argued sometimes Augusta was not a woman who submitted to decisions she disagreed with, and Wallace was not a man who found it easy to revise a settled opinion, but their arguments were the productive kind, the kind that ended in understanding rather than resentment. She had learned his particular stubbornness, and the specific approach required to reach him when he had set himself in a fixed position. He had learned that her silences were not sulking but thinking, and that interrupting them was counterproductive. In the late spring of 1887, Augusta discovered she was expecting again. She told Wallace on the porch, which had become the location of important conversations by long habit, on a May evening when Tom was asleep and Daniel was at the Corbett house for a school friends gathering, and the porch was quiet and the creek was audible in the distance and the whole world felt exactly like itself. She said, "We're going to need to expand the house." He looked at her. She smiled. His face did the specific thing it did when he received information that exceeded his immediate capacity to contain, and then he put both hands on her face very gently and kissed her, which was not a sentence but contained everything a sentence would have said. She laughed against his mouth. "The east side," she said when they had separated. "There's room for a larger bedroom and a proper nursery. I'll draw the plans this week," he said. Their second son, James Robert Ramsey, arrived in late November of 1887, sturdy and vocal from the first moment, with a personality that announced itself immediately as distinct from both his brother's serious composure and the quiet dignity that Tom had already begun to develop. James was cheerful in a way that was almost aggressive. He found everything interesting, reached for everything, greeted every person who came into his field of vision, with a look of intense, engaged curiosity that made Millie Corbett say he was going to be a politician, which Augusta privately felt was the wrong application of that particular quality, but kept to herself. Daniel, at 12, received his second brother with the authority of long-established older sibling status. He showed Tom the baby with a proprietary pride that was extremely entertaining. He told James, who was 3 days old, what a rope splice was. Augusta watched this and felt the fullness of the room, 4 children now, counting her own younger self, and the particular mathematical truth that family is not something you plan, but something you find yourself already inside. The years that followed were the years of building in the fuller sense, not just the physical structures of the ranch, which continued to expand and improve, but the deeper structures of a life lived together across time. Redemption Creek itself grew in those years, as Kansas grew, as the frontier West moved through its final transformation from open country to settled land. The railroad came through the county in 1888, which changed the economics of cattle driving and opened new markets, and created a Redemption Creek that was slightly busier and slightly more connected to the world beyond the horizon. Wallace, with characteristic practicality, had positioned the ranch well for the transition. He had been watching the railroad's progress through the territory for 2 years and had made decisions accordingly about breeding stock and herd composition that put them in a strong position when the new pricing structures arrived. Augusta had watched him work through those calculations and felt, as she often did, the particular appreciation of someone who recognizes competence in another person as one of the genuinely attractive things about them. In 1889, the territory of Kansas being what it was, and the legal status of land in the region being in the process of its own complicated clarification under federal reorganization, Augusta went to the land office to have the title to the ranch property formally updated to reflect both her name and Wallace's as joint holders. It was, in practical terms, something that had been functionally true for 6 years. Making it formally true in the county record was the kind of detail that mattered for the future, for Daniel's future, for Tom's, for James's. She stood at the clerk's counter and spelled out both names with care. Augusta Easton Ramsey, Wallace Marcus Ramsey. The clerk wrote them down and stamped the document and handed her the copy, and she folded it carefully and put it in her inside coat pocket, against her chest, where she could feel it on the walk back down the main street of Redemption Creek. She thought about another piece of paper, 6 years ago, in that same county. She thought about a forged deed and a woman who had tried to take everything. She thought about a man who had torn that paper in half in front of a judge and said, with complete certainty, that he could prove it was a lie. She walked down the main street of Redemption Creek in the September morning sunshine with the legitimate deed to her ranch against her heart, and she felt something that required the biggest word she could find. Gratitude was part of it. Justice was part of it. Love, large, earned, and thoroughly proved, was the largest part of it. She found Wallace waiting outside the land office with the horses. He looked at her face when she came out. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. She handed him the deed. He unfolded it and read both their names and folded it again and handed it back to her, and he smiled, the full smile, the one that went all the way to the back of his eyes. "Good," he said. He helped her up into the saddle, and they rode home together through the September morning, the long grass on either side of the road moving in the easy wind off the plains, the sky enormous and blue overhead, the creek audible in the middle distance where it curved through their land in the permanent way of water that has found its right course. Daniel was at the house when they returned, home from his school day, sitting on the porch steps with Tom beside him and a book between them, apparently in the process of reading his 5-year-old brother some kind of story, with the serious investment of a boy who has decided that literacy is a gift to be passed on. James was around the side of the house, undoubtedly investigating something inadvisable. Augusta came up the porch steps and looked at her sons and her house and her land, and the September afternoon laid out around all of it in its golden, impermanent beauty, and she stood very still for a moment just to take it in. Wallace came up behind her. He stopped beside her on the porch. He did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. He simply put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the September afternoon and looked at the life they had made from the ruins of the one that had tried to be taken from them, and it was whole. Daniel looked up from his book. "Mama," he said, with the imperious practicality of a 13-year-old, "James is doing something in the garden." "Of course he is," Augusta said. She pressed her shoulder briefly against Wallace's, feeling him laugh, the full laugh, the real one. And then she went around the side of the house to recover James from whatever enterprise he had undertaken, and the afternoon light lay across the ranch in the generous way of September afternoons in western Kansas, warm and unhurried, full of the sounds of cattle and water and children, and the particular silence of a man standing on a porch watching his family with the expression of someone who cannot quite believe his fortune, and is grateful for it every single day. The Easton Ramsey Ranch would stand for another 50 years in the Callow Creek Valley, growing and changing as the land and the century changed around it. Daniel Easton would grow into a man of quiet, extraordinary competence, who would one day manage the expanded operation with the same combination of his birth father's intelligence and his stepfather's patience that had always been his particular inheritance. Thomas Easton Ramsey, Tom, would become the one who rode furthest, who went to school in Topeka and came back with legal training and the deep, permanent commitment to justice that his name implied. James would be, as Millie Corbett had predicted in his infancy, someone who could talk to anyone and make them feel known, which turned out to be more valuable than the word politician implied and less cynical in its application. But that was the future, and futures arrive one day at a time. On the September afternoon that Augusta Easton Ramsey stood on her porch in the golden light with the deed to her ranch against her heart, what mattered was the present, the ground under her feet that was hers, the creek running through her land that was hers, the children who were hers, and the man she had come to love through the particular crucible of loss and danger and the grace of another person's deliberate, patient, unconditional care. She had survived the dark past. She had won the fight for her land. She had found in the process something she had not known, to look for a love that was not the echo of something previous but its own original thing, built from truth and tested by everything the country and the circumstances could bring to bear on it, and found to be strong. The sun moved west over the Kansas grasslands. The creek ran. The children's voices carried. Augusta Easton Ramsey stood on her porch and watched the afternoon go golden and felt, in her body and her bones and the whole of her life, that everything was right. Everything was exactly, precisely, fully right.